without any further ado, let me hand over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Glad to be with you all today and looking forward to our conversation. I'm just going to share my screen and double check that you can see it well. Are you able to see my slides? Okay, perfect. So today I will share some new evidence from Transparency International's latest research on the state of beneficial ownership data in the EU. But first, why is it important to look at the EU? We should care about the state of beneficial ownership data in the EU because it is a major transit and destination geography for corrupt money flows from around the world. So this is really a crucial focus geography. In this presentation, I'll look closely at the availability of data, to which extent key stakeholders can access this data, and what is still needed for it to deliver its full potential for impact. Okay. So first, just to reiterate this overarching point, which is that beneficial ownership data is really essential. That's because anonymous companies are still the vehicles of choice used to obscure ownership of tangible assets like real estate. So knowing who really owns, controls, and benefits from legal entities and arrangements, such as companies and trusts, is really essential to following the money. This information helps investigators uncover who is behind suspicious transactions or hidden assets, allowing them to connect suspects to the legal entities that they control and the assets owned by these entities. So it's really crucial information to prevent and detect corruption-related money laundering. Moving to my next slide, if it will allow me. Okay. One of our most revealing pieces of recent research was a deep dive into 78 cases of cross-border corruption and illicit financial flows originating from the African continent. And in this research, we found that 80% of the assets were held abroad. And in at least 85% of the cases we looked at, companies and trusts were used to obscure ownership of assets. As you can see from this chart, France was one of the top destinations for potentially corruptly purchased properties. And as this research emphasizes, tracing ownership across borders and across legal vehicles is central to almost every major corruption case. So where do things sort of stand now? We'll go into some depth on this. What we found is that the data often exists, but it's not as accessible as it could be or used as effectively as it could be. And so what TI is doing now is trying to bring attention to this and explain why access matters. I'd like to present some new evidence we've generated about the availability and access by competent authorities to this data. We've recently completed research where we spoke with these authorities, in particular financial intelligence units and law enforcement agencies, to better understand the barriers, challenges, and good practices that they face in investigating large-scale corruption cases. Our research covered 9 EU countries: France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Portugal, Slovenia, and Spain. And I'd like to emphasize that our host, TI Ireland, was a really integral part in this research. So thank you to Alex. Let's get into it. So this infographic presents our findings on ownership data availability across beneficial ownership registries. I'll explain some of the details that are presented here. So across the EU, beneficial ownership registers are in place, except in Italy, where it's currently suspended pending a case with the Court of Justice of the EU. And most authorities actually told us that they can easily access the beneficial ownership information of legal entities and of trusts, which is crucial for connecting the dots between natural persons, the legal entities they control, and the assets held by these entities. Surveys of these authorities indicated that more countries actually have access to machine-readable data from the Register of Beneficial Owners, the Register of Legal Entities, and the Bank Account Register than they do from registers of other types of assets. But even when access to bio data is guaranteed, it can be really challenging to connect this information across countries. Asset ownership information, like for real estate or vehicles, is less accessible. So registers for land and real estate, motor vehicles, aircraft, and watercraft exist separately within each country. So authorities cannot easily connect the data held across these different registers. And it also means that cross-checking asset ownership information with BO data can be extremely slow. So some registers, such as those for watercraft, are fragmented, meaning there are different registers in each country for different types of craft. For example, commercial craft, pleasure craft, and some municipalities have this data on paper and some have it digitally. So within countries, there's a lot of variation across the registers. Register authorities, so those who are holding this asset ownership data, may also have different data formats. How are they actually listing the information? And they may have different access standards. So how do people request this data or get this data? For example, they might make data available only for an ongoing case or provide data only as a PDF. As you can see, or maybe as you can't see, I think it's not fitting into this chart, but crypto assets are a major blind spot across all the countries that we surveyed. Crypto assets currently aren't registered, but this is meant to change soon in the EU. So just to summarize this, linking suspects to their assets remains one of the biggest practical barriers that investigators face. So to summarize, how is this? The good news is that in the EU, the data generally exists. The problem is that it's not interconnected, not in the right format, and not provided at the speed and scale that enforcement agencies actually need. So we need to harness this data somehow to really step up the fight against corruption and money laundering. So let me get into a bit more detail on what I mean by harnessing this data. I want to speak in more depth about like access and use. There's a lot of information in this chart, and so I'll explain it. But what you're seeing on the screen are the registers of different asset types and whether they are accessible to authorities. So as you can begin to interpret from this chart, our research underscores that law enforcement agencies and financial intelligence units still face major barriers to access and use of the data. They have to manually connect legal entities, owners, and assets, and that costs precious time in money laundering investigations. And as we mentioned earlier, in many countries, a formal request for access is required, such as for watercraft and aircraft. That slows investigations down. In Germany, for example, as you can see here, Germany still relies on case-by-case requests for bank accounts and land and real estate data. And in Ireland, authorities must request access to ownership information for collective investment undertakings. Additionally, we found that law enforcement agencies are often limited to working case by case, meaning they are not legally empowered to do proactive analysis. That means that authorities currently have a reactive approach, using data only after the fact. And without direct, unfiltered access and the ability to proactively use this data, authorities are just stuck reacting late to corrupt money flows. I want to point out, however, that there are some standout cases, good examples of ease of access. Italy's Guardia di Finanza, for example, their financial police, has bulk access to multiple data sets, and that allows investigators to more quickly cross-match. So there are some standout good cases and some cases where authorities have comparatively less easy access across European countries. But as we know, of course, authorities are not the only ones tracking suspicious assets. I think many of us in the room would agree that time and again, investigative journalists and civil society have proven crucial to uncovering corruption cases. So academics and researchers, for their part, uncover patterns and trends in corruption-related money laundering. And these groups play a really important role in the fight against corruption and financial crime. Because of that, EU authorities have affirmed their legitimate interest in accessing data. And the EU has now obliged member states to provide access to these groups, so-called legitimate interest users. And that access must be provided by July 2026, so next year. So what we did this year is we took a look at the current state of access in countries with current legitimate interest access regimes. We tested applying ourselves and seeing what this experience was like. And actually, we encountered a number of barriers. To me, it was quite surprising how many barriers that we encountered. Among them was language barriers. For example, the process might be partially available only in the national language, which sounds simple until you're trying to do it in, for example, Lithuanian. We encountered non-functioning digital identification portals, including in Spain, if I recall correctly, and a few other countries. We encountered unclear directions. Sometimes the online portal would say, do this, but then something else would say, do this in order to get access. We encountered contracting requirements. So for example, needing to sign a formal contract signed by the legal representative of an organization. And also we encountered fees. In fact, we were rejected outright in 2 countries, in Ireland and in Hungary, where officials said that our request failed to show links to convicted individuals or assets in high-risk countries. So the state of current practice is not ideal. And EU countries now have less than a year until July 2026 to improve this access and to ensure the access will be meaningful and effective, which is really crucial for the fight against corruption-related money laundering. I'd like to just very quickly go through what's happening on the legislative and policy side, what's on the near horizon. Major changes are coming across the EU. These changes set new standards for data availability and access. And the current year or next year is a window where the EU and national authorities are going to be putting into place newly adopted rules, transposing the latest AML package. So we will soon see centralized access points through systems like Boris for beneficial ownership data and Beres for bank accounts across the EU. Member states will also have to have their own centralized access points for land and real estate ownership data. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation when we were talking about assets from the African continent, that assets are often held abroad. So recognizing this, the EU is also implementing transparency rules for ownership of high-value assets in the EU held by foreign companies and trusts. And that's a major advancement. And by next year, we should also see legitimate interest access up and running. And the new EU AML authority, the AMLA, should be fully operational. So together, the rules that will be implemented could redefine how the EU is tackling corruption-related money laundering, but they have to be implemented well. So just to close on what TI sees as what's needed coming up. First, to deliver on the full potential of these new beneficial ownership transparency rules, we need to shift the focus from disclosure to use. So not just have the data, but to harness it effectively. We have to enable proactive, not reactive access, so authorities can try to stay ahead of the curve. And we need to embed innovation and resources in enforcement so that authorities have cutting-edge tools and training to meet the real challenges of the day. And finally, we have to ensure meaningful and effective legitimate interest access, so civil society and journalists can continue to uncover corruption. Basically, the data is there, and now the task is to connect it, to use it, to make it available. If the EU can do this, if they can make ownership data truly accessible and usable across assets, across borders and across sectors, we can really turn this data into real enforcement power. That's all from me, and I look forward to our questions and discussion later.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. And I think one of the things that stands out from what you said, and from us also being involved in some of the work that you've talked about, is the fact that much as we might find it frustrating to try and access some of these data sets, it's far from a perfect picture when it comes to authorities, but they also have quite significant and often quite surprising barriers to accessing information that we would have thought they would have fairly seamless access to. So I'm going to follow on from what Catherine was talking about, to look a bit at the situation and some of the findings from our work on one of the projects that Catherine mentioned at the national level here within Ireland. Let me see if I can share my screen. Is that coming across okay? Yeah, so okay, so just in very brief terms, over the last 12, 18 months, we, together with a number of other TI chapters in different European Union countries, have been doing a fairly large-scale study looking at the fight against particularly cross-border and complex corruption, money laundering, and associated financial crime. And a large part of that has been looking at what data is collected on a range of different asset classes and corporate vehicles, how that data is stored, how it's made available. And we've been focusing primarily on how that data is made available to law enforcement agencies and regulators. But we've also taken care, given, as Catherine said, given the importance of journalists, civil society organizations, and academics in often exposing some of these cases in the first place, we've also taken care to look at the availability of this data for what we now generally call legitimate interest users, to coin the phrase used within the sort of EU nomenclature, including the latest AML directive. So we looked at legal entities, so that includes companies, and I guess of particular relevance in the Irish context, and I'll come on to it in a second, limited partnerships. We looked at legal arrangements such as trusts, bank accounts, land and real estate, vessels, private aircraft, and high-value vehicles, crypto assets, and again, importantly, in the Irish context, alternative investment funds or collective investment vehicles. And in the course of doing this, we looked at a whole range of different registers administered by at least 7 different agencies that come under the aegis of 5 different government departments. So you can imagine there's a lot of diversity in there that we found. So as well as Catherine highlighted very well that different law enforcement agencies and state authorities across the EU have varying levels of access to these different data sets. So we found, perhaps unsurprisingly, real diversity in access for the public and for media, for civil society and academics. And that's a diversity in access was mirrored in terms of the willingness of different state bodies to engage with us as a civil society body. Some were very forthcoming and seemed to do their best to be helpful. Others were incredibly reticent and essentially refused to or declined to engage with us. Once we did get through to most, if not all of them, it was clear that the data that was collected in different formats, stored in different formats, made available in different formats. What we often found is that data that was made available, and this includes being made available when they were able to the public and to the media, but also to state authorities. That data wasn't always made available in a format that was easily searchable. So PDFs is a typical one in the Irish context that doesn't lend itself to effective bulk data analysis. Catherine touched upon the role of fees. Now, in the Irish context, fees for access to different registers don't tend to be prohibitive in and of themselves. They tend to be fairly low. However, this does become an issue for bulk data analysis. In a second, I'll come on to the topic of limited partnerships, but there was a very effective investigation done, I think in 2022 by Bellingcat on Irish limited partnerships. And they found that the fees to access information held by the company's registration office in and of themselves wouldn't have been prohibitive, but what they were seeking to do bulk data analysis, and that became such an issue they had to apply for a specific grant to enable them to be able to carry that work out. So fees, understandable when it comes to seeking out information about one particular company, for example, one particular land folio. But if you're looking to do that across hundreds, if not thousands, then it's a whole different matter. Again, unsurprisingly, we encountered on the part of officials that they were very cognizant of these debates and this tension, a healthy tension, I think, in most cases, but this tension between privacy and data protection and transparency. And I guess one of the reflections that we encountered looking at these different data sets is that they were all set up with very different purposes. It's not that we have a set of different sets of financial and corporate data that were all set up with the aim of assisting the fight against corruption, money laundering, or wider financial crime. They're typically set up for very specific purposes, and then their utility for those of us interested in tackling corruption and financial crime is then sort of bolted on as an afterthought in some respects. So that can affect what information is collected, how it's collected, etc. I'm just very quickly going to go through really sort of just scan over a few of the sort of key deficiencies in the Irish context in terms of the different data sets. So beneficial ownership, Catherine's explained the importance of it. Interestingly, and as she concluded and said that one of the focuses for TI is to encourage better use of beneficial ownership information, we certainly got a sense from state authorities that they don't necessarily understand the full utility of BO data. So that's a really important point. But I think one of the key issues in the Irish context, certainly Ireland is unique amongst the 9 or 10 countries that our project looked at, in that we have 3 separate beneficial ownership registers, one for companies, one for administered by the CRO, one for trusts administered by the revenue, and one for what's called certain financial vehicles, which is essentially collective investment structures, which is administered by the central bank. Now, the fact that we have 3 separate beneficial ownership registers means that the information is fragmented, and if you are an investigator, at present, obviously the BO registers are only available to state authorities, but after July next year, it should be open to legitimate interest users such as ourselves. That data is fragmented. It's like scattering a jigsaw that then has to be pieced together, which makes an already hard job even harder. We certainly found that Ireland adopted a very restrictive approach to beneficial ownership transparency after the infamous Sovim ruling from the Court of Justice of the EU in November 22. And we then had this statutory instrument in July 2023 that purported to give legitimate interest access. So in other words, purported to give access to the likes of those of us on this call, but in actual fact made it, to all intents and purposes, impossible, because one of the conditions, in addition to demonstrating that you're involved in investigating money laundering or terrorist financing, you also have to demonstrate that the company or the structure that you're interested in has a connection to a person who's been convicted, not even arrested, charged, convicted of money laundering or terrorist financing, or holds assets in a high-risk third country. Which begs the question: why would you be asking? Why would a self-respecting investigative journalist be asking this question in the first place? That may be of interest to a historian, but maybe not to many others. And certainly in our attempts to engage with the Department of Finance and other state bodies to encourage them to revisit this very restrictive approach to legitimate interest access. We've encountered an unwillingness to do so, and essentially the line has been we'll wait until we transpose the relevant part of Article 12 of the 6th Anti-Money Laundering Directive, which has to be in place by July next year. Another crucial sort of weakness that we found, perhaps unexpectedly, was around vessel registration. Again, we found a really fragmented setup here, where we have what really is an unreformed 19th century approach to registering ships. There are 13 different registers for each of Ireland's official ports. They're paper-based ledgers, and when I say ledgers, they're huge, vast books, which you know a grown adult would struggle to lift up. There's no searchable electronic version, so there's no ability for members of the public, journalists, or indeed state authorities to enter a vessel name into a database and get its details of who owns it, etc., who registered it, etc. The public are able to inspect these registers. It's quite hard to do. I did it myself up in Dublin Port, but I wasn't allowed to take any copies. And crucially, the information in these registers is unreliable, in that there's no mechanism for verifying the information that's submitted. There are no penalties for falsifying information placed into the register. There's no enforcement of that, and actually, the officials that I dealt with admitted that that often they suspect that vessel details, when there's a change of ownership, aren't updated reliably. And on top of all that, although there's quite detailed information collected about the actual vessel, and again, this comes back to the purpose of the register in the first place, the full name of the owner is not collected, neither is the date of birth or the nationality or passport number. Interestingly, legislation was passed in 2014. There is an act there on the statute books to create a searchable electronic register with verification mechanisms in place, but that act has still not been commenced. And I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to just really skip over these two particular subjects. Limited partnerships, we've also got, I'm very aware that we have two experts on these subjects, I think, on the call. But limited partnerships are quite common across particularly common law jurisdictions. In terms of Irish limited partnerships, we've known for well over 5 years through revelations in the Panama Papers and subsequent investigative journalism that there are real weaknesses in the transparency around Irish limited partnerships. Journalists found, I think 3 or 4 years ago, that 2/3 of general partners of Irish LPs were based in offshore locations, in particular the BVI, Cayman, Belize, etc. And they've been found to have been promoted, including on Russian-speaking websites, as opaque, tax-free, offshore, low-risk structures, which are available really to anyone to set up. Crucially, there is currently no obligation to register the beneficial owners of limited partnerships, nor to have an address in Ireland, or even in most cases to file accounts. And what we saw is, after restrictions were imposed by the UK government on Scottish limited partnerships some 7 or so years ago, that registration of Irish LPs increased over 7-fold. Now, there is a bill that's been introduced to address some of these deficiencies, or at least in response to some of these issues, but we would say that it's still got certain deficiencies, and there's no time frame for the introduction of that bill. And finally, just very quickly, special purpose entities. These are structures that are set up for a specific purpose. They're used for quite a wide variety of different purposes. In the Irish context, they're particularly used in aircraft leasing. And Jim Stewart, who I see on the call, has done some fantastic work around this. They're also used in particular by the investment funds industry. They typically can avail of what's called Section 110 tax neutral status. They often span several jurisdictions. They can be incredibly complex. They've been linked through previous academic research to tax avoidance, shadow banking, and round tripping, that's recirculating capital. And we're starting to see an admission at official level that there are major deficiencies in the transparency around special purpose entities and in terms of their anti-money laundering supervision. So the central bank has admitted that 90% of these structures do not fall within the criteria for being supervised for AML purposes. And as a consequence, there are it's been admitted that these pose real risks, both in terms of money laundering, wider illicit finance, and indeed to financial integrity and stability. So there was a review conducted last year, which was published autumn 2024. It made several what I think are good suggestions or recommendations for reform. And crucially, in terms of the subject we're looking at today, in terms of the transparency, one of their recommendations was that a full list is published by the central bank of all SPEs that avail of Section 110, which we think the majority of them, and that it's linked to a legal entity identifier, and that's made public. So I don't want to rattle on too long, but these are some of the financial and corporate structures that we think pose particular risks or weaknesses in the Irish context. But from some of the more policy level issues, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask our journalist colleagues if they can give us the benefit of their perspective on seeking to access different data sets for their day-to-day work. And I'm going to start by asking Alice Chambers. Alice, if you'd like to give
Hi,
us
Alex.
a view. Thanks very much.
You can all hear me? Great. Very nice to be here. In a previous life, I actually worked for Transparency International in Berlin in the Secretariat before I became a journalist. So it's nice to kind of be back in the fold a bit. I work for an online publication called The Currency. It's a business publication. It was set up 6 years ago now by two Irish business journalists who felt that there was a gap in the market for more long-form business journalism. And I would say that's exactly the type of stuff that relies on all these registers and data that we've been talking about. My colleagues and I access a lot of these. I can talk a little bit about bits and pieces of them. I know that the SPVs, the special purpose vehicles, they're used as well in a lot of development deals. I haven't worked so much on that, but one of my colleagues, Niall, has been doing a lot of work, for example, on iPass accommodation and developers who are changing their buildings into iPass accommodation in order to avail of government contracts, and often that happens through SPVs. There's so much to talk about, but what I thought I would do was take you through 3 stories that I've done recently to kind of show you practically where the pitfalls are. Of course, you can talk at a high level, but until you start sort of looking at the data, it's, I think, a little bit harder to understand. And so what I'll do is I'm going to share my screen just to start with the first one. So bear with me for a second. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is just a tab that you should all be able to see now. At The Currency, I do a lot of renewable energy coverage, which is interesting. It's huge sums of money, lots of foreign companies, and quite an important policy area, I suppose, for the Irish government. And so earlier this sort of autumn time, I started looking at who is actually winning these government contracts. And I'll say from the outset, there's no suggestion of wrongdoing or anything here, but this is just the sort of general news and sort of in-depth stuff that I think The Currency and journalists like me can kind of provide to say, well, like, who is winning these contracts? And without getting into it too much, the government awards these RES contracts to help prop up renewable energy in Ireland, and it's a 1.9 billion sort of market. So it's interesting to know what who's winning what. Now, the problem the problem with trying to figure that out is that for every wind farm and solar farm, typically a developer will create a new company. And that kind of makes sense from a risk mitigation point of view and a management point of view, but then you're trying to kind of figure out, who ultimately is the owner of these companies. And it would be great if it was straightforward, but it often requires a lot of cross checking in different databases. And so I started by going to the Department of, or sorry, to EirGrid, who keeps a record of this. And I might just now. I wonder if I can, if I share a different tab. Let's see how possible this is. Hold on a second. And I created a big spreadsheet to try and figure out who owns what, because typically you'll have the successful applicant. Can you see the spreadsheet? Yeah, good. And this is me filling this in. All these are me, but you only have kind of these two pieces of information. And this particular case, so I've just taken a section of the spreadsheet. There's a man called Mernan who got in very early in the early days of wind, which is quite an interesting story in itself, and has managed to stay in. But he's got such a patchwork of companies, and so what I would typically do is find the successful applicant. I mean, Alex talked about how costly it is to figure out this stuff. Like you can see this spreadsheet has 232 lines. If you were to access the company's registration office 232 times, that'd be extremely expensive, especially for a relatively small outfit like the Currency. We subscribe to something called Search for Less, which is essentially a database of the CRO information. Can you see that tab there now? And so we would you can put the company in there and get financial information about it. And it'll give you, what's been filed, etc., etc. And then you can scroll down, you can look at all the shareholders. And the shareholder is something called Clona Unlimited, an international organization. That doesn't bode well. And then you click on it and you realize that it's it's actually based in the Isle of Man. So then you're thinking, okay, great, what do I do now? So at that stage, we went to the Isle of Man, and there they have a registry of companies, and we got this document here. Um, can you see that? Yeah. And now, fortunately, Michael Mernan isn't interested in hiding himself particularly, so it's just registered here, him and his wife, and I think possibly his son. And so we were able to say that this company was owned by Mernan. Often the trail ends in Luxembourg, which has not a bad register as well. But I think like that does take work, and often you'll end up hitting a wall here. And so you're then talking about calling people, you're trying to cross-check it with other information. And so even though this example seems quite straightforward, there's a lot of work that goes into every one of those. And then it's 230 lines on a spreadsheet that you're trying to figure out. So that's one example. The second story that I want to talk about is infrastructure. And so this was one that I published at the start of the year about the Port of Cork and their massive infrastructure investment into building the means of taking in offshore wind turbines so that they can then be built off the East Coast, ideally, and soon, ideally. That's a different story. But you can imagine, so the ports in Ireland are semi-state companies, which means that they're not actually state-owned. Well, the state is the shareholder, but they're commercial entities, which limits the transparency a lot. And I think if my first story was an example of trying to track down company information, this and the next one is going to be a story about trying to track down what the companies are actually doing, because it's all very well to kind of be able to figure out who they are, but trying to figure out what they're doing is equally important when you're talking about huge sums of money. And so although the port is a commercial entity that doesn't take taxpayer money, it has received huge investment from the Irish state, which is taxpayer money. Now, it will be, in theory, it's paid back, but it's still public money. And to build this infrastructure, they have a contract for 120 million to a building company, and that's the first of many. They've got other suppliers and all that kind of stuff. Now, I went to the port and I spoke to them, but I also wanted to check on their tender information to see like where the money was coming from, where it was going to, who was winning these contracts. And now I asked them directly, and they explained that they awarded a contract to Ward & Burke in September last year. And Ward & Burke is a Cork-based company. But and again, no suggestion there's anything wrong with this, but it's actually without going to the port and convincing the commercial officer to tell you who's won, or hanging around and looking for hoarding. There's actually no way of finding this out online. So Ireland, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, procurement is very much dictated by at EU level. Ireland has their own national database called eTenders, and then there's TED, which is the EU database. And so you can come to this and you can look up the Port of Cork company, you can search for the tenders they've put out, and you can see that there's 15 results, which first of all would probably strike you as strange, and it strikes me as strange. First of all, the state decided to change who runs their tender website in 2023. So there's actually no data now available online pre-2023. They kept the old database live for a while, but it was provided by another company. And so at some point that sort of sunsetted out and you can't access it anymore. So we have anyway 15 contracts, and this is the one, this here number 11, if you can see that, is the one that I'm kind of interested in. I think that's the Ward & Burke one, 120 million, and you can click and find out a little bit more about it. It gives you a sort of vague overview. Two companies were interested in it. That's sort of an interesting thing. Maybe it's very hard with procurement to say what's normal or what's abnormal, but it's often interesting to see how many people even bid. And then you can look at the menu to get some of the documents which will tell you what's going on with them. But there's no, as far as I have been able to work out, and I've spoken to the Office of Government Procurement, they're interested in making this better, but I just don't think there's that much incentive. Like that, it's really set up to help companies, and you can log in as a company and access more stuff, but the public don't have access to that. You need to be a company to create an account. So there's actually no indication of who won this tender. And then you go to EU tenders and you do an advanced search, and we can look up. Sorry, it's just taking a little bit long. So we can look up all notices, and we can choose to see results only. And then we go to the place before. Sorry, hold on one second. You can. Oh, yes, here we go. Sorry. I did a run through of this and I've just forgotten where the box was. So we can go to the Port of Cork and see what comes up. And in this case, we get a bit more data because this database goes back further than 2023, but there's only 9 results. And that 120 million euro tender isn't on it. This goes back to 2016. And like, I can call people, and in this case I did, and I went to the port and they told me who had won the contract, and so that's in the public domain now. But it's actually this is really more problematic than I think you might at first think. Well, actually, I'm speaking to anti-corruption and transparency experts, so I'm sure you probably already have an idea of how problematic it is. But this is the third story I'm going to show you. which is some more work that I've been doing on the Port of Cork. And this is a story that I published over the summer, conflict of interest allegations at the Port of Cork. And in 2024, the CEO of the port resigned, and later that year he sued the port. And so I made a number of FOI requests to the Department of Transport to see what I could find out about Port of Cork governance. And I got a number of FOIs back, heavily redacted, that gave me enough to write a story, but didn't, although there were all these accusations of conflict of interest. Sorry, I'm scrolling a bit meaninglessly here. The FOIs didn't explain what the conflict was, that those parts had been redacted. And I requested a register of interests from the head of the chair of the board, got that back, but it was quite redacted, and I only got it for one member, that the chair of the board. So my instinct was to say, well, I wonder, what kind of conflicts are we talking about? I wonder if the procurement data will tell me anything. But of course, it's so limited that it's really hard to tell. I mean, there's people on the board who are in the sort of service sector. I would be interested in service contracts. Who is the port asking for sort of financial and legal services? But you just don't get those results. And that's the kind of information that I have asked the port for, and they're much less interested in telling me who's on their legal framework or who's on their accountancy framework or whatever. And again, I'm not suggesting that there are issues necessarily, but this is the kind of public information that would really help me do my job and let the public know whether there are issues or not, because at the moment you just can't really tell. And so I think I'm probably at time there. So I'm going to stop and look forward to any questions you guys have. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And also, please, if anyone's interested in contacting me about anything or chatting about this sort of stuff, I'm very open to that. You can find me on LinkedIn, or my email is alice@thecurrency.news. So thanks again for inviting me. And that's sort of an overview of some of the issues we have with databases in Ireland.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alice. Then it's absolutely fascinating, and I mean, I think your presentation speaks to several different points, but including amongst them the fact that a lot of the things we're talking about go far wider than outright corruption or money laundering, for example. They speak to other issues around corporate governance, for example. On the specific issue of public procurement, we've engaged with the OECD on the islands taking offline the historic procurement data, and I'll follow up with you separately on that. But
please do. Any insights there would be great. It's unbelievably frustrating. I mean, these contracts last 10, 15 years sometimes, and we just don't know anything about them anymore.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And without further ado, I'd like to move on to your colleague in arms, I guess. Lois from the Dublin Inquirer. Lois, if you're there.
Yeah, I'm here. Can everyone hear me? Great. Yeah, thanks so much. I'll try to follow that. But my name's Lois, and I work for a kind of independent local newspaper here called Dublin Inquirer, and we cover Dublin City and Fingal, so we are very local. But obviously, nothing is always local. So one of the big things that I cover is housing and property. And so weekly we'd be researching ownership of property in the city, not so much in the context of black money and money laundering yet, but mostly from the position of trying to work out who the beneficial owners are of companies, companies that might own buildings that say are long-term vacant or derelict. Maybe they're rental portfolios where there are repeat claims of poor management and maintenance, or even there are illegal or sharp practices, and trying to work out the ownership of those buildings. And I guess, increasingly in Dublin in particular, you have real estate owned by overseas entities. And it may seem a bit baggy, but for kind of communities and tenants, I feel it's really feeding a sense of a lack of control, both over sort of their own fates if they're living in buildings where they don't know fundamentally who they're renting from, and also of their neighborhoods if there are kind of big developments, landowners, and you know that's feeding attention and disempowerment if you feel your environment is being shaped by essentially anonymous entities. So I guess in terms of sort of identifying property ownership, as you say, the land register is expensive. For repeat searches, there are ways to search by owner rather than searching through portfolios. But if you're saying doing a street or something and it's going to be different owners, then that really can add up. In terms of charges on properties, I would look at the company's registration office, and luckily through the libraries you can access all that for free. So that would be somewhere we would go to. And recently I also got access to North Data, which is a website that sort of searches simultaneously across multiple company registers and sort of does a bit of mapping of structures, which then is a good starting point for checking that. I guess the other, like, just broadening it out a little bit from the money laundering and the corruption, I guess for me also, you have the kind of irregularities around tax, but you also have sort of planning issues and sort of vacancy, and there are a lot of policies at a city council level that are supposed to be dealing with those. But there's, I kind of think, a bit of a weakness in that they don't know a lot of the nature of the entities or individuals who own that property. And I think, you know, if you don't know what incentives those owners have in terms of what they plan to do with it, or what their investment strategy might be, and you can have a good guess at it if you do know more about that entity, then I think that makes a big difference in terms of the effectiveness of policies and what levers you might try to apply and what might work. And I think particularly around the city centre, it's likely that they will run into that. And then, like, I do feel as well that there probably is a lot of international black money and, you know, flowing into real estate in Ireland, and, you know, opaque ownership registers and sort of the thresholds for what names are included and not make that extremely difficult to track. So I'll just run a little through my experiences accessing beneficial owner registers in different places. I was looking through my email to find past examples of how successful I've been over the past few years, and not very successful. And it's always a little bit embarrassing to admit because you don't know whether it's yourself or the register. So I'll be very honest. So like my past experiences in Ireland were mostly around the central bank, trying to get beneficial ownership for different kinds of financial vehicles. And at the time that was 2021, and that was relatively easy to get that list, but who were on the list were senior managing officials rather than owners. So it wasn't really that helpful in terms of actual sort of shareholders or you know, really who the beneficial owners are, I think. I've also tried to access the Isle of Man, or wrote to the Isle of Man to try to access a straightforward company beneficial ownership details, and was refused. I think there were two criteria which I had to meet, and I didn't meet either. And then more recently, trying to track the ownership or shares of a Luxembourg fund, which owns a lot of property here through Cypriot subsidiaries. So tracking it back through the Cyprus Companies Register, which has language issues, but was possible, and then back to a Luxembourg fund, but then having issues with the Luxembourg register for a couple of reasons. I need to fill out the form, but I kind of am a little off-put by thinking that I'm not going to get access. One, because I don't have a track record in writing about money laundering, and the other being I actually let my union membership lapse when I was on maternity leave, and I haven't redone it. So I need to redo that. And I know that's my fault, but it's just sort of these barriers that when you're doing other things as well, just always push it slightly further down the agenda, especially if you think you might end up with sort of admin people on the list or nothing on the register anyway. And it's sort of a bit of a time benefit analysis that you're constantly doing. Like I think in terms of the track record with reporting on money laundering and corruption, to me, like that's deeply frustrating. I feel like you have extremely like amazing high profile entities like ICIJ or OCCRP, who are great people and would probably be granted access. But I imagine there are lots of local reporters on the ground who that might not be their specialization, but actually if they've been doing something a while, if they're writing about property in particular, they are going to come across entities, and they are going to know little anomalous buildings, or that seem to be being managed in a strange way, or that don't quite make sense. And they should also be able to be accessing this stuff and checking it, and then following it. That's what we do. We learn like, and so the logic of gatekeeping, I feel like I just don't understand why more of this isn't just automatically transparent. Like even beyond like who's a legitimate person, I'm just a pro publish it all. These high net worth individuals have extreme privileges in terms of the impact they have on cities and landscapes and people's lives. And I think a bit of transparency is the least that could be asked. So yeah, I'm trying to think of what else I have to say about that. I don't think I've got much more, so I'll keep that short, sorry. But I'm happy to answer any more questions, or if there's anything else. Yeah. Is that okay?
No, that's great, Lois. Thank you so much. And I again, like Alice, what you've demonstrated is the utility of these different data sets, in particular beneficial ownership, but wider as well, for the wider public interest, sort of stretching far beyond what I guess TI's main interest is, but looking at tenants in a building wanting to know for completely legitimate reasons who ultimately owns their building, who they're paying their rent to ultimately. But you also touch on this issue of where is the money coming from in terms of property investment, and time again in TI internationally and in Europe more specifically, we see property and real estate being a classic area in which people launder illicit funds. And then what was really interesting, what you were saying, is the role of investment funds. And one of the issues that we've been flagging since 2021, TI did a report on the funds industry in Luxembourg, coming back to that country again, and highlighting from way back, from whatever it was 4 years ago, that the current thresholds in the European Union context for reporting beneficial ownership of 25% is never going to capture the investors in a fund structure. It's just not. And so we're trying to think about how going forward do we advocate around that. I mean, that's a big sort of macro policy issue, but great to highlight it. So thanks so much. And last but certainly not least, Chris Laslett from Ulster University. Chris, I'll hand over to you and ask if you can give us an academic's perspective on some of these issues.
Yeah, great. Hopefully you can see my shared slides now. And to say that I enter this now in a state of great agitation and being pissed off after hearing everything that people have been saying about the barriers they're facing. And I think we should be outraged at the legitimate interest tests and how they're being used. And I'll add a little bit of opinion at the end of this on that, just for what it's worth, my 2 cents. But in terms of the formal presentation, so I'm an investigative criminologist. My focus is on transnational economic crime with a specific focus on grand corruption. And most of my work is digging into the networks that are involved, the business structures they use, the offshore jurisdictions that they draw upon for their craft and their secrecy, and the professional gatekeepers that aid and abet them in their criminal pursuits. And so obviously when you're trying to unpack this, I'm using a whole range of different data points to try and investigate these groups and networks. And I'm just going to walk you through the way in which these different data points can help, and obviously also the risks when we encounter barriers and limits like that have been pointed to in all the presentations thus far. So, I mean, I think obviously in this kind of investigative work into corruption, having access to open corporate registries is absolutely crucial. To kick it off, it gives you critical data points. It tells you who the office holders are of companies. It tells you who the shareholders are, who the UBOs are. It provides you with information about obviously their name, their addresses, their at least month and year of birth, which is really critical when you're trying to make sure you've got the right person, and you're not conflating. And even that data can be very critical. So, for example, one of the criticisms that's made of Companies House in the UK is they don't verify UBO data, but it's the persons with significant control. And of course, people who are involved in corruption, fraud, are usually not going to disclose in an honest and open manner who their UBOs are. So they might put Daffy Duck in, and that will appear on the register in the UK. But I'd argue that often that information is still vital. So in a case that's about to come out soon with Media Partners, we've been looking into a multi-billion-dollar fraud. The key company is a UK one. They've obviously put in a person with significant control. It's not the real person with significant control. It's an elderly person in England, but we've been able to work out by triangulating the data with other companies' data in the UK that elderly person is a direct family relationship, has a direct family relationship with the owner and proprietor of a corporate service provider. And then we've been able to look at who the corporate service provider's clients are through the same company data from Companies House. And we've worked out that they have one set of major clients from Uzbekistan where this fraud is taking place. So we can reasonably infer from all that triangulating who the persons with significant control may be, despite the use of improper use of a nominee. And it's not just me who's finding that use. I've got up on the right-hand side of the screen some excerpts from the recent PrivatBank case. PrivatBank is a bank in Ukraine. It's now been nationalized. Before it was nationalized, it was the subject of a multi-billion-dollar fraud where money was stolen from the bank by Kolomoisky and Boголюбов, the owners of the bank. And they did the fraud by setting up dozens of offshore shelf companies that received loans, and then they didn't pay back the loans, and the money was whisked off into various exotic locations for their use. And in the High Court judgment, PrivatBank was nationalised, and they took litigation against Kolomoisky and Boголюбов and were successful in the High Court in England. And they noted that in the decision, it was noted that that there was evidence that when they began to realize that they were under scrutiny, they realized that a lot of their shelf companies had directors and nominees who, if you then triangulated the data with other companies, you would work out that the companies that were receiving the fraudulent loans, that those nominees had direct connections with companies where Kolomoisky and Boголюбов were the stated UBOs, and therefore you could connect the shell companies back to the owners of PrivatBank, and they were like going, "Oh crap, we better try and break that chain." So that goes to show how even when you're dealing with complex forms of deception, if you have access to rich metadata on the people involved, you can triangulate it and get behind the scheme and find out who the real conspirators are and what they're doing. Certainly, hang on one second, I'm trying to move to the next slide. And so certainly, I mean, another example on the right-hand side of the screen, down the middle, you'll see I was investigating the capture of Uzbekistan's gas resources by a network of individuals. One of the individuals that came up was the sanctioned business person from Russia, Gennady Timchenko, who's sanctioned because of his close affiliations with the Kremlin. And again, obviously he didn't appear on the share register as connecting to key companies in this gas capture case. But we were able to look at one key company called AMGA Consulting, And we found out that Amber Consulting had a very unique address in Russia, and that address was connected to the Volga Group, and several Volga Group companies, and the stated UBO of Volga Group is Gennady Timchenko. So that provided a data point for making an inference there. Similarly, there was another company involved in this gas capture case, Forus, joint stock company. It had a nominee shareholder, but the nominee shareholder had been shown in other companies to have been replaced by Gennady Timchenko. So that made another data point suggesting that Gennady Timchenko was the likely beneficial owner of these companies, despite the use of nominees. So that's just another example how when you have access to rich data, you can triangulate it and get past these structures that are used to obscure. Similarly, the same thing goes for financial filings. When we're able to access financial filings, they can provide a rich source of data, because in financial filings, you have everything from if it's a holding company or the companies that they own, the related party transactions that they're involved in and what the nature of those related parties are. You have access to transactions that they're involved in. And so the examples I have on the right are unusually, because often Cyprus is known as a secrecy haven, but anyone who works on Cyprus intensively knows that you can get access to rich audited financial reports and financial filings, and you can use that to reveal things that perhaps the filers didn't imagine you could do. So in that same gas capture case, you'll see here on the diagram on the top right, there's Gazprombank, and they've loaned money to an Uzbek company, Natural Gas Stream. And Natural Gas Stream is using that large loan to convene tenders, which were awarded to another company called Ariel to drill the gas fields. But through looking through these Cyprus financial filings, we're able to see that actually Gazprombank didn't stump up with the money. They were just an intermediary. They issued a euro note, which was in fact purchased by a company called Ariel, who happened to also be the ones being awarded the contracts to drill the field. So they were both loaning the money to the Uzbek gas field operator, and then getting which was part state owned, and then getting the drilling contract. So that's an example of how when you triangulate financial data from Cyprus filings, you can reveal some intriguing facts that perhaps the filers didn't imagine you'd be able to uncover. And again, the value of this kind of data. I'll jump over that because I'm conscious of time. And I want to jump on to saying that one thing that maybe hasn't been mentioned thus far, but I think is a really critical data source, is open justice. Courts can be an amazing source of data, and I've had experience of everything from the best practice that you can find today, which would be something like the US, where you can jump on right now. We could jump on PACER, their online court archive system, and we could grab court transcripts, we could grab all the submissions, we could grab even exhibits and use them. And then you have everything to places like Switzerland, where you can just get judgments and they're anonymized. So you get used to everyone being known as A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. And through to Singapore, where, as you can see from the bottom right-hand corner, you have to kind of beg and to get a judgment that should be public. They're not public, and you've got to write to them, and they don't answer, and it's a long and drawn-out process. And again, this data can be crucial, both as a source of knowledge for academics. I mean, can imagine the massive investment that goes into every enforcement action. That's taxpayer money. And those enforcement actions should secure justice, but they should also be a resource for knowledge and a source of intelligence for future investigative work. So here's an example of transcript from a prosecution in the US involving a professional money launderer, Ray Akavan, and that transcript excerpt is a meeting he has in a plush hotel in London, where he meets with a gentleman you might have all heard of, Mr. Jan Marsalek, who was the former COO of Wirecard, and who's now absconded to Russia, where he is because he was involved in aspiring. And what you can actually find out from this wonderful transcript is how he worked with Ray Akavan. You can work out some other people who are involved as well, who continue to own major financial, well, shall we say, a bank in Europe. And that is all there on the court transcript. So you learn about how they do their money laundering, but you also get amazing intelligence on people who the US Department of Justice accused of being conspirators, who continue to be operating in the European space at a senior level. And similarly, I won't go through these, conscious of time, but here's other examples. The Privet Bank case provides evidence of how Igor Kolomoisky, once he was, sorry, I just lost my voice suddenly. He must be getting to me. But Kolomoisky, he was being investigated by the central bank, and it details the threatening actions he used and intimidation he used against individual regulators to try and to deter them. On the right, you can see a classic example of a Swiss decision where it's actually provides incredible detail on the money laundering office set up for Gulnara Karimova, the daughter of Uzbekistan's first president. Amazing source of knowledge on how they do what they do. And it provides really intricate detail on the office, how many people work there, how they did their money laundering, and move corrupt proceeds. But of course, you need to be able to know who A, B, C, D, F, G, H, I, J, K are. And obviously that takes a lot of work, and most people wouldn't be able to do that. And then, of course, you have the case of places like Singapore, where it's even more difficult. And then, just to say, lastly, certainly in my own work, all those types of portals that have been mentioned thus far are really valuable, and I won't go through them because I think they've already been catalogued, but I'll just give you one example, again from Uzbekistan. So everyone's going to be learning a bit about Uzbekistan today. I was investigating a series of tech companies that were getting, so we say, sort of suspicious monopoly contracts from the government. One was down the bottom left, eReport Services. Another one was Avdotest Report. Obviously, human sources had said these companies were actually beneficially owned by a guy just above called Komil Alamjanov, and he denied that. He was a government official, and the shares are owned by people who obviously wasn't him. But then, because I was able to access the intellectual property database and I was able to see the patents that these companies had, they were curiously all owned by Mr. Komil Alamjanov. So there's another example of how, if you can move between databases, triangulate, you can begin to see things that perhaps the filers didn't intend you to work out, and say things that are quite valuable. So that's it from me. But I'd just like to say, I mean, I think responding to some of the other really fascinating talks thus far, and being made irate by them, as you can hopefully tell by my animated state. I mean, I think in the world of anti-money laundering, it operates, for it to be effective, it requires a whole network of actors, and the absolute front lines, it's not law enforcement always. It is often journalists. It is often NGOs, and it is often, to a much lesser extent, though, it should be more academics. And they are the front lines. And in so many of the corruption cases I've worked on, it was not law enforcement. It was not the banks filing SARs. It was journalists. It was NGOs. It was exposing what happened. And then suddenly banks file retrospective SARs. Law enforcement from countries get embarrassed and they begin to do their work. So I get really worried. For this system to work, all these players need free access to information, and in order for all those players to play the role they do in this anti-money laundering network. And secondly, I would just say two final points. This idea of, I mean, a lot of these things like companies and trusts, these are social privileges. These are not the things that punters on the street get access to. They give the people who use them enormous privileges that are granted by our societies. They have a basic fundamental duty to account for how they are using these privileges. And I think it's outrageous that we've allowed the argument to be flipped on its head, where we're begging for access for information on these entities. And the final point there is this point around legitimate persons. I mean, my work has shown that there's a huge conflict of interest for states. They are a lot of states, the ones that have been mentioned to Ireland, through to Switzerland, Latvia, the UK, they all make big money out of marketing themselves as offshore service providers, and they do not have an interest in people being able to scrutinize who and what are using their structures. And therefore, it's very cute of them to set up these seemingly legitimate barriers, but I would suggest that it's a little too cute, and we need to call them out for it and say they are actually complicit in allowing a whole range of crimes that are threatening, not only financially threatening, but are allowing malign actors who are threatening the very security of Europe through these barriers that they're setting up. All right, that's it from me.
Chris, thanks so much. And we could definitely tell that you're invested in this topic. So really
I'll
grateful.
stop sharing too.
No, really grateful and fascinating stuff. And I'm really glad that you raised the topic of access to judicial records or court records, which is absolutely fundamental. And we haven't got a huge amount of time because all of us have been quite probably gone over our times a bit. But I would encourage anyone who's on the call who's got questions to either raise their hand or drop a question into the chat. We've got 10 minutes left. If there's nothing there at the moment, I just follow up with you, Chris. If just in sort of 1 or 2 minutes, if you could give us any thoughts on how the UK's, given the sort of proximity of our economies and obviously geographically Ireland and the UK, how the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act of 2023, to what extent, if any, it's made a difference in your work in terms of reliability of data that you can get hold of or access points. Just any sort of quick thoughts on that whilst people gather their thoughts and perhaps put any questions up there.
I mean, I guess the answer is it's too early to tell yet. And I know there's more we're waiting to see whether there's going to be greater vetting and whether that vetting is going to lead to more accurate information. But listen, I would say one thing is, like, the people who we look at in grand corruption, they are sophisticated people. They're not going to have any problems getting very nuanced front people with a whole range of paper. They'll get the first-rate law firms to help them paper these companies. But listen, that's not the point. You'll never be able, when people want to deceive the public, they'll always find ways of doing it. But the point is, the more information that we have and the more we require them to dip their hands in the blood by verifying things and people going on the record to say law firms so that they incur responsibility, the more chance we have when we do exposés of holding all those different complicit parties to account.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks. I'm keen to sort of see how that act translates into, how it affects people like yourself doing the actual investigative work. Alice, you've mentioned there in the chat that you're happy to get on your soapbox about Irish courts transparency. I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Sure. Because we have a court, one of my colleagues covers the courts full time, but I dip in and out, and I find it horrifying how terrible access to court records are in this country. I studied journalism in the US, and for all our fear over sort of illiberalism in the US under the 2 Trump presidencies, I find the standards of access for information over there considerably better. Here, there's limited information about what court cases happen, and then if you want to know what's going on, you really have to be in the court, or you have to be an extremely sophisticated observer of the court. And it's, there'll be corporate cases going on every day. Transcripts aren't routinely made. The solicitors tend to have to pay themselves for those. So you then have to know who the solicitors' firms are, which aren't often listed on the official High Court website. District Court and High Court, depending on the value of the sort of case being taken. I'm talking about company stuff for the moment. Then there'll be a record online that affidavits or submissions have been made, but you can't access those unless you make a written request with a PDF to the Central High Court office, High Court Records Office, which, quite apart from the transparency side of things, geographically, you have to be in Dublin then to go and collect those because they won't send them via email. They print a stack of copies once they've checked with the judge that it's okay. And then a week or two later, you go along to the High Court Records Office and you get these documents. Maybe when you make your records request, you have to prove that you know that they've been what's called opened in court so that they are public documents. But how do you prove that you know that? You have to have been in court. So, if I go to a case 3 years ago, I can make a records request. I can't prove that they were opened. If the judge has moved on or if the staff at the court have moved on, there's a risk I won't get those. And then once I have them, it's a stack of photocopied pages. So, you're not going to find information with a control F in there easily. And I think we should be so much more outraged. And I don't think people kind of realize, including legal professionals, like I've had solicitors say, well, sure, would you not just access those documents from the SharePoint? And I'm thinking, you think we have access to the SharePoint? Like, no. But, I don't even know what the case is about when I turn up in court and I have to type as fast as possible to put that on paper and then figure out what's going on as it's happening. So I just think there could be a lot more done around that. And when you launch a legal proceeding in Ireland, you have to file a statement of claim and a grounding affidavit. And at a bare minimum, those should be publicly available to anybody who wants them. So anyway, that's my rant.
No, thanks so much. And we've certainly, we don't have the capacity to do really work on individual cases. We tend to focus on the policy dynamics, but on the few occasions where we have sought what record, it has been that experience has been like wading through treacle, and I'm reassured to hear from others like yourself that that's not just us. No, thanks for that, Alice. Just one sort of last opportunity for anyone on the call to ask a question, raise their hand, or pop a question into the chat. I'm also really grateful for Chris and I think one or two others raising the issue of nominees and corporate service providers. That is another area that we would see as particularly problematic. I don't know whether anyone on those who've been on the panel have any particular thoughts or reflections on that, but it's certainly an area that we see being used time and time again for further obfuscating the details of, as Chris said, it's another line in the sand that makes it more difficult for whether it's law enforcement investigators for that matter or for journalists, etc., to look behind the veil. If nobody's got any outstanding questions,
there's one hand raised.
Yeah, Constantino has a question.
Thank you.
Hello, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me and Alex. We worked on a joint proposal related to this, so it was very instructive to me, and I didn't prepare any presentation, so sorry for being there. I wanted to say that it was amazing, and I agree with all of you. And what Lois said, for example, I totally agree with you. It should be totally transparent here, especially if we consider this related to democratic values. I mean, if democracy has a sense, we have to vote, we have to know where the money goes, and if related to politicians. And this shouldn't be only open to us, it should be open to anybody in a democracy. And also for the issue that you raised about judicial proceedings and documents, Alice, I can say to you that I did it for a paper that I wrote in anti-corruption in Italy, and I managed to get this Italian Supreme Court decision only because I'm also a criminal lawyer in Italy. I had to go physically in Naples. I have to ask personally to the judge that gave me an ad hoc decisions that was okay, and I had to promise in writing, I have to promise that I had to redact the things in a way that was impossible to understand it, and I had to make this formal promise. And then I got it physically because there is nothing translated into English or electronic. I got the papers and I had to scan them. And, imagine if you would like to do the same thing for 100 cases all over the country. It's just and and I agree with what you said about the United States. Is problematic. There are problems there, but at least there is transparency of data. And in Europe, we don't have this transparency of data, and it's a mess, and we have to solve it. So I think your work is amazing. It could actually, have a very important value.
Yeah, thank you so much, Costantino. Great to sort of round off with bringing this back to democratic values. I think we'd all, concur with your sentiments, and I'm glad that we've covered technical points through to the sort of the underlying values that ground a lot of our work. Just for the last minute, I'm going to hand over to John, our Chief Executive here at TI Ireland, just to say a last final comment and thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I wasn't able to join at the very beginning and managed to listen into most of the discussion, which I found as rich and informative as I expected it to be. Such was the caliber of our panel. And I see something of a germ of I'm not allowed to use the word campaign, because there's some provision in the Electoral Act around this. But I foresee more work in this area with us collaborating more closely with journalists and other civil society organizations to address what is a clear lacuna in the law and what I consider to be both a manifest risk to Ireland's to the public interest, both here and overseas, something which gives rise to serious corruption risks, but it also is something of a national embarrassment. I'm a member of the government's Advisory Council on Economic Crime and Corruption. We'll make sure that this is discussed further at forthcoming meetings on the council. And I look forward to hearing from you and seeing you again in the not too distant future. And just like to thank you all, especially our panelists, Alex, for hosting such an interesting discussion, Francesca for helping organize it as well. Wish you all a very happy Christmas in the meantime. Alex, I'll hand back to you, and thanks again.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. We won't keep you any longer. We've gone a couple of minutes over, but just to add my thanks to all our panelists, for everyone who dialed in, and to Francesca for organising it. And to wish you a happy International Anti-Corruption Day, and as John said, in due course, Christmas once we get to that point. And look forward to seeing you all and working with you all in the future.
Thanks all. Have a good day.
Bye.